Right. Thanks for the introductions. You guys can all hear me and see the slide, right?
Yes.
All right. So hello everyone. My name is Muoi, final year PhD student from the National University of Singapore. I'm going to present our papers on the routing of web queries against Network-Eclipse attacks in Bitcoin. This paper will appear at U6 this year, and it's a joint work with Akshaye, Shenoi, also from the National University of Singapore, and my advisors, Mr. Kang, we are now at KAIST. Perhaps the most exciting technologies behind Bitcoin is a blockchain. And essentially, the blockchain here changes a block where each block contains several valid transactions. And this blockchain is maintained and updated by all nodes participating in Bitcoin networks following a set of consensus rules. The logic of consensus rely on the node forming a peer-to-peer network to transmit the block or transmit data. And in this talk, we focus on this underlying network. When it comes to securities of blockchain peer-to-peer networks, one of the most dangerous threats is partitioning attacks. And in partitioning attacks, the adversary isolates targeted victims from the rest of the peer-to-peer networks. And once the victim is isolated, the adversary can arbitrarily inject, drop, or delay the communication between the victim and the peer-to-peer networks, and non-zero follow-up attacks between the victim, such as double spending attacks or censoring transactions. And this is actually what happens in 2020 in an Eclipse attack in Muoi, where the cryptocurrencies, and the attacks dropped the transaction of several users. There are a few partitioning attacks introduced in the last couple of years, and most of them have been already mitigated effectively. They include a botnet-based Eclipse attacks introduced using securities 2015, which doesn't work anymore because they own exploited vulnerabilities have been fixed. Another existing work is the routing hijacking attacks appeared IQ SMT 2017. However, the attack is immediately detectable and attributable. More recently, we presented the Erebus attacks at IQ SMT 2020. The Erebus attack is stealthier than existing attacks and harder to prevent. And in this talk, we discussed the practical countermeasures to these Erebus attacks. The Erebus attacks are network-Eclipse attacks in Bitcoin, and let me explain how it works. First, you need to know that Bitcoin node use an internal database to store the IP address of other nodes and select its peer from this internal database. And second, the Erebus is a malicious autonomous system, or AS. In this attack, the adversary spoke the peer identities using the IPs behind herself in the view of the victim. These IPs are shown in the top of the figures on the left-hand side are called shadow IPs. And then,
excuse me. Well, sorry. Your microphone seems to, change volume quite dynamically. So we have a bit of a problem understanding full sentences. So sometimes it's good, but then it gets worse quite quickly.
So,
can you switch to another mic, or I don't know what your setup is. So.
Okay. So the the volume. Let me try.
Try another microphone.
They sound better now?
Yeah, much better.
More consistent now.
Yes, much better.
Yes, much better.
Thank you, and sorry for the interruption.
Yeah, no way. So let me continue. So I was talking about the shadow IPs, and once the adversary got the shadow IPs, the adversary slowly insert the shadow IPs in the adversary slowly inserts the shadow IPs into the victim database, and then influence the victim to select those shadow IPs. And when this happens, the attacker becomes the man in the middle of all peer connections of the victim, and the victim is Eclipse. Let's just take a deep look into the technical aspect of the Erebus attacks, such as how many shadow IPs that the attacker can use, and how can the attacker influence the peer selection of the victim. To answer the first question, I will show you the abundance of shadow IPs with an example. In this example, the victim is a Bitcoin node running on Amazon AWS, and the attacker is a big ISP in the Europe. Then on small clouds here are the AES hosting the shadow IPs or the shadow AES. From our large scale experiment, we found that if the attacker is big enough, it can easily find hundreds of shadow AES, which contain millions of shadow IPs. And note that the attacker can use any IP address in any of these shadow AES, because the shadow IP does not necessarily need to be a real Bitcoin node. We now know that the attacker can control a lot of IPs. Now we discussed how the attacker visual how to influence the victim node peer selection with shadow IPs. And to explain that, let me briefly describe the Bitcoin peer connections. So each Bitcoin node open 10 outgoing connections to other peers and accept up to 150 incoming connections initiated by others. The attacker goes here is to occupy all 125 peers of the victim with the shadow IPs. And at a high level, occupying the incoming connection can be done simply by connecting to the victim with shadow IPs, and it's really easy in general. On the other hand, the attacker must influence the victim to open the connections to the shadow IPs, and this is much harder. And how to do that is what I am going to show you now. First, we must understand that how a peer's IP address is managed by a Bitcoin client, and we call it the life cycle of an IP address. And each Bitcoin client stores the IP address of other peers in two tables. The new tables includes the fresh IP address received from other peers, and the child table includes the IP address that this client has made a connection to in the past. And then when the client receives an IP address, the IP is inserted into the new table. And if the slot is already occupied and the existing one is too old, then the new IP evict the old one and take over the slot. And every 2 minutes or so, an IP address in the new table is tested. And if it accepts the incoming connection, or in other words, is it reachable, is it promoted into the child table. And again, if the slot is already occupied, the existing one is tested again. And if it is unreachable, then is it demoted back into the new table. And after a while, the new table tend to include the unreachable node, and the child table tend to include the reachable IPs. And finally, when there are not yet 10 outgoing connections, a reachable IP is selected at random from either new or child table to establish a connection to. And here, the attacker goes to dominate the reachable IPs in the two tables with the shadow IPs, because it increases the chance that shadow IPs are selected as outgoing connections. Then, how can the Erebus attacker dominate the two table in the current Bitcoin client? The attack strategy turned out to be very simple. For occupying the new table, the attacker keeps sending the shadow IPs to the victim. These shadow IPs will evict the unreachable IP in the new table. And from our experiment, the shadow IPs dominate the reachable IP in the new table after around 30 days, because by then, shadow IPs have replaced many unreachable P in this table. For the child table, the attacker patiently wait because they want reachable IP is promoted like from the new table to the child table every few minutes or so. And note that there is no other way to directly insert the IP into the child table. And we observed that the number of shadow IPs in the chart table keep increasing gradually. And eventually all connections are made to the shadow IPs in about 5 to 6 weeks of attack execution. Now we know how the Erebus attacks work. How about the countermeasures against these attacks? Countering Erebus attacks is unfortunately quite challenging because the attacker with the network capabilities only exploit the permissionless layers of Bitcoin peer-to-peers to find millions of shadow IPs to eventually eclipse the victim. And compared to about 10,000 nodes in the current Bitcoin network, millions of identities are huge numbers. There already exists some approach for countering the Erebus attacks, such as some workaround like VPN, Tor, or whitelisting some reputable node. However, such live solution rely on external service in the current Bitcoin system. Alternatively, Bitcoin communities had quickly implemented some protocol tweaks to make the adversary spend more attack execution time, such as increasing the number of outbound connections from 8 to 10 using IP to AS mapping in the peer database, or reconnecting to the old connection upon restarting. However, they are not complete solutions. And indeed, we actually evaluated the effectiveness of the available protocol tweaks. And here is the result. The y-axis shows the attack success rate of the Erebus attacks, and lower values so better defense. For the accurate definition of what is the attack success rate, please refer to our papers. And in this experiment, we evaluate some tweaks on how peers IP are managed in the database, and some tweaks thus improve the peer selection logic. And as we can see from the chart, all available protocol tweaks show only marginal effectiveness. And knowing the limitation of the existing countermeasures, we turn our attention to a known solution from literature that has been used to handle similar attacks launched by a network adversary, which is route-aware peering. Route-aware peering, or RAP, is frequently used to avoid on-path network adversary, especially in Tor systems, such as last Tor or counter raptor, and so on. And under RAP, peers are selected based on the routing path to the peers. And let us see how it works in Bitcoin with the previous example. Here, the victim used RAP before establishing the peering connections, and RAP calculate the routing path from the client to the peers and have to detect attacker appearing on the path. So the Erebus attacker should be easily detected, as you can see from this example. Are we done? Can RAP prevent Erebus attacks simply like that? Unexpectedly, the answer is no. Unfortunately, we found a subtle problem with this approach. As always, the devil is in the details. In particular, we found some non-idealities of RAP implementations. Assuming a victim node is getting the routing path to the shadow IPs on the right side, here RAP can guess the route by measuring the traffic route using some probing tools, such as trace route. However, the problem here is that the Erebus attacker is already on the path, and the attacker can easily manipulate the result or even drop the probing packet. Hence, route measurement cannot be used in practice. Alternatively, the victim can establish the forwarding route or query the local routing table for the control plane routes. However, the estimation can be inaccurate and miss the on-path attackers. And this leads to some shadow IPs can be misidentified. And what is worse is that so misidentified IPs can be exploited by Erebus attacker, like who is now aware of this RAP defense. In particular, smarter Erebus attackers can use only the misidentified shadow IPs to undermine RAP, the attacker first select the misidentified shadow IPs by emulating the best RAP defense, and then the Erebus attacker inserts only the misidentified shadow to the victim. So can RAP prevent these smarter Erebus attacks? To answer this, we perform a large-scale experiment of about 6,000 scenarios in which the attacker top runners AS and the victim run at 59 different locations, including popular cloud networks like Amazon AWS, DigitalOcean, Alibaba, or Google. And our evaluation frameworks include an accurate Bitcoin emulators that mimics the peer management and establishment of Bitcoin client. And for accurate emulation, we also use the actual Bitcoin message captured by our loop in more than 12 months as an input for the emulators. We also assign the online duration of the victim using the churn rate distribution of real Bitcoin node. And we do open source this emulation tool, so please check our paper for the link. And here is the result. We find that Erebus attacks against the baseline client are successful in 55% of the cases. And when the client implement RAP, the attack success rate decreased, but to 33% only. This results so that, in contrary to our expectation, RAP alone is insufficient to prevent the Erebus attacks. So why does RAP not work in Bitcoin? First, RAP estimation is known to be imperfect, even with the state-of-the-art implementation. And here is an evaluation of the miss rate of 4 state-of-the-art RAP estimation approach when we compare the estimated routes and the measured routes. And it shows that there are at least 6% of the shadow IPs are misidentified when the victim query the control plane routes from the routers. And here is the distribution of the number of shadow IPs and misidentified shadow IPs. And we can see that the number of misidentified shadow IP is significantly smaller than the numbers of the original shadow IPs. However, we can also see that the attacker can still find tens of thousands of spook peer identities using those misidentified shadow IPs. And this explains the successful Erebus attack case that we saw in the previous slide. So to sum up, like knowing none of the defense is sufficiently alone, we attempt to make the best of the available solutions. For the sake of comparisons, we saw again the success rate of the attacks against the baseline client is 55%. And first, for RAP, we find that RAP must be customized accordingly to each Bitcoin node topological location. And for example, we need different RAP customization for 2 different nodes, in which one node in highly well-connected network, while the other node is in a single home network. And please see our papers for more details and how to customize a RAP profile. And we find that the location customized RAP profiles can reduce the attack success rate to 9%. And yeah. And second, we also need to evaluate all combination of the protocol tweaks to find out the most effective one. Because very interestingly, adding more and more tweaks doesn't always guarantee a better defense. And the most effective tweaks combination that we can find reduce the attack success rate to 21%. And lastly, we find that when we combine RAP and tweaks together, we have the most effective defense so far. Just make the attack success rate drop to only 3%. And one reason for this effectiveness is that RAP forced Erebus attacker to use the misidentified shadow IPs that are more restricted and making the protocol tweaks work more effectively. And In conclusion, contrary to our expectation, route-aware peering or RAP alone is insufficient to prevent Erebus attacks. And because there are no perfect error-free route estimation for RAP in practice, and also smarter Erebus attacker can exploit RAP weak links to undermine. However, we saw that most Bitcoin nodes can be protected from the Erebus attacks. And when RAP is customized for each Bitcoin node and combined with the available protocol tweak carefully. For more information of the deployment of RAP and other protocol tweaks, please visit our website with the following link. And for that, I conclude my presentation. I would be happy to take any question. If you have other comments or would like to work with me on this direction, please email to moichan@com.nus.edu.aziz. Thank you.